Hey, what's up everyone? DREAGEN back again, here to tell you that you should be watching The Dark Crystal: Age of Resistance. So The Dark Crystal: Age of Resistance is a 2019 Netflix fantasy series that serves as a prequel to the original Dark Crystal film from 1982, written and directed by Jim Henson, and basically kind of tells the story of what happened to the Gelflings. Basically, with the Dark Crystal, you realize that they find out the Skeksis basically kind of wiped out the civilization due to a prophecy that stated that it would be a Gelfling that would basically bring them down, that would basically undo their power, so they kind of freaked out and, took matters into their own hands. And this is taking place during an age where the Gelflings are all thriving, they're everywhere, and they are actually in service to the Skeksis, the Lords of the Crystal, and essentially believe them to be the kind of these noble kind of almost angelic figures who basically rule over this land, and they are very much in the service of them. Unbeknownst to them, that the Skeksis have become corrupt with power, and are now seeking means to continue their own life. They have kind of corrupted the crystal that basically they've been siphoning its power to, achieve immortality, and now the crystal has become corrupt, and now the crystal is no longer providing them with the kind of power they need to sustain themselves, so they go on like this search of how do we continue this on. And it's basically how they discover the power of essence, that they can draw essence from those who are closest to Thra, which is the planet in which they live on. And basically by draining their essence, they can kind of achieve or continue their immortality. And they basically learn that the Gelflings are filled with this essence because they are the closest beings to Thra itself. And it is essentially kind of how the Gelflings kind of discover this malicious plot by those they have been kind of born to serve, brought up into believing that, they are not just lords of the crystal, but lords of this world, and that they are kind of the grand overseers, and that we should, trust unto them, without question, and basically kind of find out that basically the people you have trusted the most your entire life are the people who are essentially, conspiring against you. And again, it is the story of kind of how this all came to be, how basically the fall of the Gelfling civilization, and how we find ourselves, at the Dark Crystal, where there's only two Gelflings left, who are essentially the only ones who are left to fulfill this prophecy. And this is basically kind of bridging the gap, or rather connecting us to that point. Now, there's currently one season of it, there's plans of a season 2 and potentially a season 3, although that has yet to be confirmed. So the series ends in such a way where it does not directly connect the events of this story to that of the film, but again, I'm sure that's going to, in a future season or future seasons will bridge that gap. But this first season, at the very least, kind of chronicles how the Gelflings came to start the rebellion, how they've came to learn of this plot against them, and what motivated the Skeksis to kind of start this plot. What pushed them to finally go down this route? Why turn against, the people who have been serving them so loyally for so long? Well, what drove them to that? And how this kind of rift between the Skeksis and the Gelflings was formed, and the ensuing conflict. Now, like the original Dark Crystal, this series is brought to life with the work of puppet work and practical sets. There is some digital work to it. A lot of digital work just kind of either enhance some of the puppets, or just kind of to enhance some of the environments, or just to kind of, smooth over some of the action sequences. There's some great wide shots where you might see the Gelflings kind of running fast in the distance, and whereas in the original 1982 film, they would put like a child in kind of a full suit and just shoot the scene very wide, so you would see them, running in the distance to kind of create that effect. Here, a lot of times that is done with kind of digital work. There's another new Skeksis in this film, or rather an older one that was not in the original. As a good point too, again, the original film, they explained that they were once more Skeksis, I'm not quite sure, I say Skeksis, that the ones we were seeing in the film are the only remaining ones, which means in this story, you see Skeksis that we hadn't seen in the original film. There's one in particular that's very cool, for shots of him kind of leaping through the trees like the Predator. Those are usually done digitally, but again, the digital work is used sparingly, basically when you cannot achieve something with a practical effect, and it's integrated very well. So it's not like it feels disconnected. It feels very much like it's in the same universe as the film. They're just using newer technology to kind of touch up, enhance, or just make certain techniques with using practical effects a bit easier on the filmmakers. So it very much is kind of like a harkening back to like the way they used to make these stories. And it's interesting that in 2019 we've come full circle to a point where there's now such a love and even nostalgia for not just movies from the 80s, but also how movies in the 80s were made, because there was a certain charm to them. And while they're not ignoring, modern advances in filmmaking and storytelling, they are finding ways to kind of blend those modern techniques with these older techniques, a lot of which still hold up to this day. And some of the puppet work and a lot of the practical effects in The Dark Crystal, a lot of it holds up to this day. I mean, sure, there are some things about it you'll look at it and be like, well, it's fine because the movie was made in 1982, but realistically that doesn't really hold up to today. And it's little things like that excuse me, that they do in the series where they'll kind of just use some digital touch-ups just to kind of, enhance, fix a little bit, but never to kind of, outshine the puppets, the practical effects. And because of that, it is a true kind of mastering of this technique of using puppets and practical effects. So it very much is interesting that we live in a time where, we can now make movies and shows the way we used to, 30 plus years ago, and it is now acceptable that we live in an era now where there's an appreciation and a love for different types of filmmaking techniques, that it doesn't always just have to be a digital effect, it doesn't always have to be made just in a computer, that we can now embrace this long history of filmmaking and this, using all these different techniques that have been developed over the years to tell a story. Rather than seeing it as something that's outdated, we can now see it as just another thing that is in our wheelhouse, another color, in our color palette, so to speak. So we can kind of pick and choose. We can use a puppet here, we can use a digital effect here, we can use animatronic here, we can use a matte painting, that this series uses matte paintings, we can use green screen. There's all these different tools at our disposal when we want to do fantasy storytelling, and there's no need to necessarily limit ourselves to just one. I understand if you have a $200 million budget that you can use digital effects that look like real life, that's fine. But if you don't have that kind of budget, if you don't have an Avengers budget at your disposal, well, there's a lot of techniques that have been developed over the years that filmmakers can utilize to tell a story, and they have their own charm and their own beauty. There is something unique about a practical effect, and puppets are an art form in and of themselves. So to see them celebrated in such a way shows you that if you're a fantasy or a science fiction storyteller, there are so many different avenues you can take to tell your story. And The Dark Crystal: Age of Resistance is just an example that something that was developed over 3 decades ago can still be relevant today and utilized today to tell a compelling story. And some of the best dramatic acting I've seen in a long time was in this show, and it was coming from puppets. And it was amazing to see, because you kind of quickly forget that they're puppets and you feel that they are characters, and you find yourself being so emotionally invested in these characters because the people who bring them all to life are masters of their craft. There's even a great blooper reel online where you can see where the actors who were controlling the puppets on the set, the actual voice that you hear in the show, are ADR'd after the fact. So on set, it was the puppeteer reading the lines, and there are great moments when they were actually messing up their lines, outtakes, you don't get the line right, and they would mess up their lines and keep operating the puppet. So you would see the character mess up their lines, and as they're laughing and joking, to continue to move their hands around in the puppet. So it's like the puppets on set flubbing their lines and laughing about it and then goofing off with each other. They would just immerse themselves in these characters that after a while, even on set, it felt like these puppets were the characters, like these puppets were the actors themselves. And it was just kind of this total immersion into this project that really translates on screen. And when you watch it and you realize that it's a bunch of people with their hands and upper bodies up inside these things, and yet you're seeing a fully realized living character on screen. And it is kind of just the magic of just this form of artistry, and that again 30 plus years later, it still works. There's a reason why The Dark Crystal is this timeless classic. It's not just because for when it came out it was a kind of a big deal, but it's also because it's it's a beautiful film to look at, and capturing what made that film beautiful in the series while kind of building upon it, while not ignoring what we've developed since, but finding a way to kind of integrate it into what The Dark Crystal was, is really kind of a triumph of, I think, of storytelling of this kind. It's something that I hope to see continue, that, older film techniques still being embraced today and being, treated with respect and reverence, and realizing that you can tell a great story with, an effects technique that came out a long time ago, because if you do it correctly, it's still relevant. It's still a relevant, piece of artistry. So The Dark Crystal: Age of Resistance, I highly, highly, highly recommend it. If you've never seen the original film, watch the original film. But let's say you just haven't, you're in a kind of maybe a unique position to kind of watch the story in kind of chronological order, I guess, in the sense you can kind of see the events leading up to it. Again, season 1 doesn't lead up directly into the movie. There's still a gap, but it gives you enough of a sense of what happened, where therefore if you jump to the movie from there, you can kind of realize, okay, I see how it started, I see how it ends, and then I can kind of figure out maybe a little bit in the middle probably what went down. And depending on when you're watching this recommendation, the entire series might be out, and if that's the case and you haven't seen the Dark Crystal movie, there you go. You can watch however many seasons of this there is and then jump straight to the movie and get the complete narrative. But if not, you just watch the movie, because the movie is a beautiful story and it's kind of cool just to see how it all ended, and then go back and see, okay, now how did we get there? What led to that? And the series functions very well as a prequel in that sense, because it makes the movie more relevant, because the movie was something so singular and so specific that you can't help but wonder, okay, what went down to get us to that point? And the series so far has done a good job of setting that up, and I'm very curious to see what future installments are going to do, regardless of how many more seasons are going to be. But anyway, guys, Dark Crystal: Age of Resistance, have you seen it? If so, what did you think? If not, it's on Netflix. As far as I know right now, there's no home media release. If there is, I will put links in the description section below where you can do and check it out. But again, if you have Netflix, it's on there. If you don't have Netflix, I'm not being paid by Netflix, but honestly, there's a lot of good stuff on Netflix. There's a lot of stuff I watch, a lot of not just original series, but a lot of great smaller films, independent films. It's a great showcase for kind of stuff that maybe doesn't get as much attention that gets shown on there. So again, this isn't me, trying to get in Netflix's back pocket, but I've seen a lot of great independent work, foreign films, on there too. So it's not just the big Netflix produced shows. But again, if there was ever a reason to get it, this is a damn good reason, because it's a damn good show. So check it out. Let me know what you think. And as always, I will catch you in the next one. Peace!